It's a much deeper problem than that. The doctrines that I'm opposed to are predicated on, well, one assumption they're predicated on, it's probably the primary assumption, is that the best way to view history is as the domination of a tyrannical male patriarchy, and that's true also particularly of the West, which is a doctrine I find absolutely unpalatable and historically absurd, biologically ridiculous, and ungrateful, among other things.
Who's ungrateful, sorry, in that? Who is being ungrateful?
Look at what you have.
Right.
You live in the best society that's ever been created. You know, I was reading about some Indonesians.
I mean, do you mean me as a woman or me as a 21st
us.
Century person in the world?
I mean us, yeah.
I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for what I have, but to me the project of politics is...
construction of a tyrannical patriarchy. You're grateful for the productions of a tyrannical patriarchy. How does that make sense?
Because I think life is good. I think it could be better. That's what being
fine.
a progressive
That's a
means.
perfectly reasonable proposition.
But I guess
that isn't commensurate with your claim that you're the beneficiary of a tyrannical patriarchy.
Why not?
How can it be good if it's the consequence of a tyrannical patriarchy? Tyranny isn't good, is it? I mean, that's the definition of tyranny. Something that isn't good, and yet it's produced all these things that you're grateful for. Like, doesn't that contradiction bother you? Where did what was good come from?
I think I'm benefiting actually from a lot of things that I don't support, that are unearned privileges in my life. I think that's absolutely true.
Like your job?
Like I have a very good job. I had a loving family. Well, I don't think that's going to do the world any good, is it?
That's a hell of a fine rationalization for your privileged position.
Oh, well, fair enough. But if
you could trade it off with someone who's less privileged.
I could.
That'd be a start.
I could do that, but I don't want to, and I won't, and I don't think I should be expected to.
Why not? Is it okay for you to occupy a position of privilege in the patriarchal tyranny? And if it is it because you're female, or is it just because it's convenient?
Let me tell you my political philosophy. I guess I'm a social democrat. So what I believe is that you should, if you have a good life, you should try and pass that on. I believe in a progressive redistributive tax system, for example. It was once said by Lord Mandelson in British politics, New Labour was okay with people being filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Now, I'm kind of less okay with people being filthy rich. But
Define filthy rich.
Well, I think I would leave that
You're probably in the top 0.1% of people who've ever lived on the planet. That would constitute filthy rich by historical standards.
Okay, but I'm not
sure
that I'm
going
going
the line exactly?
Be able to help the Neanderthals at this point, really, by giving up some money. But this is my point, is that what I believe is, I believe in a structure in which people who have had a good life and had lots of advantages should pay that back, pay that forwards, which I think is the message that you preach as well, right? You have responsibilities. And if you've had, like us, a lot of advantages in life.
Western civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy.
But it's not purely a tyrannical patriarchy,
That's for sure.
Is it?
It's purely not.
Right.
And that's exactly the issue.
But why
because
would you deal with moral absolutes?
When you describe it as a tyrannical patriarchy, then you make a case that it's purely that. And that's exactly what's ungrateful. It's not purely that at all.
Why is saying that something has elements of this made the same as it is purely that?
That isn't what's being said. Merely to define it as a patriarchy implies unidimensionality. And to insist that that's also tyrannical doesn't offer a balanced viewpoint at all.
Well, I think that's probably where your disagreement comes with this, which is because I do not see it in that way. I do not see that as univariate at all. I see it as one element.
Then why call it a patriarchy?
Because it describes an overarching structure.
Does it?
Yeah.
What if the patriarchy is fundamentally composed of women? Is it still a patriarchy?
No, that would be a matriarchy.
Would it? So let's say we take a patriarchal structure, like the medical profession, and we fill it primarily with women. Is it then a matriarchal structure? What makes it a patriarchy to begin with? Is it the hierarchical structure? Is it the fact that it's mostly men? Is it the sociological structure? Or is it the fact that it's mostly men?
Well, I think that's really interesting because male primary school teachers, for example, only 15% of them are men. And I interviewed some of them for my book. And you know what? They report exactly the same things that women do in male-dominated offices, right? They say, people have conversations that I feel excluded from. I feel stigmatized, like I shouldn't be here. People look at me askance when I say I'm a primary school teacher and I'm a man. They kind of reel back. We all make those implicit associations.
So if it is a structure that's dominated by women, then it's also a tyrannical patriarchy.
I think in that case, then men have a way they should be able to complain about the fact that a very female-dominated office leaves them feeling out too. Yeah, feeling left out too.
So how do we get something that isn't a tyrannical patriarchy? If it's composed of women, then it's a tyrannical patriarchy, and if it's composed of men, it's a tyrannical patriarchy. We're kind of out of options.
Right, or you could have an office in which a blend of people of both sexes work.
So if it's 50-50, then it's not a tyrannical patriarchy.
No, not 50-50. I'm saying that people...
40-60.
I'm saying that there is clearly, when it is only 15% of male primary school teachers, they do feel marginalised and excluded. So
you think the defining hallmark of a tyrannical social structure is the predominance of one gender, and if that was relatively equalized, then all of a sudden it would be a free and open institution.
I don't think that male primary school teachers are being tyrannized. I do think they are being marginalized, and I do think that they feel excluded and stressed by that.
So what do you do about that?
Well, this is what I mean. I think actually, and I'm surprised you don't agree with me on this, that actually having more male primary school teachers would be a really good thing, because boys need role models, actually. People, particularly boys who don't have a father figure in their life, that's really important for them to have a stable adult who shows them what it's like to be a man around the place.
Could be, but you shouldn't achieve it as a consequence of preferential hiring.
No, I don't think it would necessarily need to be preferential hiring. I think it would probably be about making that job, breaking down the stigma to entering that job. I think teaching is a really interesting example. It was seen at the turn of...
I worked in daycares when I was 18, 19.
Right.
You know, there were no men in it.
And how did that make you feel?
I loved it.
Yeah.
You know, the kids, I used to wrestle with the kids, which of course you can't do now because everybody knows that would just be a catastrophe. And I used to draw them pictures of monsters and they'd line up for that. And I liked working with kids quite a lot. And I didn't care whether it was female dominated. I've been in female dominated my professions my whole life.
Right, I think... I
haven't felt marginalized as a consequence.
Well, then you have been lucky, and I have talked to people who have
might be luck.
The opposite.
Might be careful conduct as well.
Explain that more to me.
Well, why would you assume that it would be luck?
Well, if I say that there is a statistical analysis, and I've talked to a broad range of people, and you would always expect outliers at either end. Some people have had a really terrible time. Some people have had a really brilliant time.
Yeah, well,
everybody else in the middle.
One of the things that I've strived to do is not to become resentful.
Well, okay, that's very good. I have to say that your Twitter feed does not give me that impression. You come across as somebody who takes criticism very much to heart. Is that true?
I don't think you have any grounds for that suggestion. I mean, you've seen my interviews online. If I was someone who took criticism at heart, I'd be in a lot more trouble than I am now.
In what way?
Well, I've been criticized endlessly for 2 years. I've been in scandals. I've probably been in, I don't know how many scandals in the last 2 years, and had unbelievably contentious interviews with journalists online, on TV, on radio, in podcasts. If I was someone who couldn't tolerate criticism, the evidence for that would already be clear. Twitter's a strange social network. I've kind of pulled myself away from it. So it's not an easy place to conduct yourself with as much grace as you might. And I think it sort of rewards impulsivity because maybe it's because of the constraint on characters or something like that. So I think that people tend to show their worst on Twitter, and some of that's a consequence of the structure of the technology.
I think I certainly agree with you. I think that's something that we agree on there. I think people are rarely at their best on Twitter.
No, and I pulled myself away from it quite a lot in the last month, mostly to see why. I kind of kept an eye on Twitter, all the social media networks for the last few years, partly to see, well, I'm trying to monitor what's happening around me, I suppose, is probably the right way of thinking about it, and to see if I'm making mistakes and how they might be rectified. But I don't think Twitter's been good for me, and I don't think the reply function on Twitter is useful, and I think the fact that so many people on Twitter are anonymous is not a good thing at all.
Do you think you'd be less angry if you weren't on Twitter? That's something I think quite a lot. I would come into contact with less things that annoyed me on a daily basis.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah. I think that's definitely the case. And I've talked to other people who've pulled back from Twitter and experienced the same thing. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something about Twitter that seems to really heighten the desire of people to be provocative. And maybe it's the case that only people who are feeling irritable respond. We don't know, like if you put up a post and 1,000 people read it, certainly 1,000 people don't respond. A few people respond. Well, maybe it skews way over to those people who had a bad day. Like, we have no idea, right? Because it's a communication channel that no one understands. We're not evolved to understand it. We're not evolved to use it. We can't interpret it. Plus, you're interacting with random strangers, which is something you never, ever do. And it's never the same set of random strangers. And you don't react to Twitter like it's random strangers. You react to Twitter like it's a person that you know. And it isn't.
You write in 12 Rules for Life about having had violent impulses that you didn't act on. And I think in Maps of Meaning, you sort of elaborate on that. You say you fantasize about stabbing a classmate in the neck. And you're very clear about the fact that you've never, ever thought that you would take those seriously. But it just does make me think whether or not, are you somebody who thrives on anger, who finds anger to be something that they need in their life, that they find motivates them to do the things that they need to do?
Those are two different questions.
Okay, you can answer them both.
One is whether I thrive on it, and the answer to that is most certainly not. So I actually don't like conflict. It's
Then
very
how
hard
have you
on
ended
me.
up doing this as a job, which is arguing with people, right?
Just because no, that's not my job. It's not to argue with people.
Okay.
So my job is to not do things that I don't think I should do. Right, and my government made the mistake of assuming that compelled speech was acceptable as long as it was motivated by hypothetical compassion. And that's not happened for me. So I made that point. It wasn't because I wanted to or because I enjoyed it. I don't really like conflict. I'm actually a rather agreeable person, which is partly why I'm a clinician. And so I find the constant conflict exhausting. But that's not the issue. You're not morally obligated. You're morally obligated to do things other than that which you like. So now I really do enjoy the lecture series that I'm doing. And the reason for that is that it's not political in its essence. I'm trying to do everything I can to bring people who are trying to develop a vision for their life together and to encourage them to act more responsibly, but not in a finger-wagging sort of way, but because I've come to understand that the meaning that sustains you in life is mostly to be found through responsibility. And through the voluntary adoption of responsibility, you're very likely to find your fundamental strength. And I think that that's clinically unassailable observation. And that's all very good, and I'm very pleased to be doing it. And it seems to be having a salutary effect as far as I can tell. And but it's not because I thrive on anger. I mean, you were at my show,
on
days
Thursday
ago?
night, yeah.
How much anger was there in that?
Well, I thought it was fascinating because it was in Long Island. We drove to it and we went past a Lamborghini dealership, a Porsche dealership. This is not a poor area. The audience was, I would say, very as I was surprised how many women there. It was pretty mixed. It was overwhelmingly white. And I thought you talked, you said at the end, this is more incoherent than I normally am. You ranged across quite a range of subjects from, status in monkeys to perception. But the things that the crowd clapped and they applauded where you went, oh, you can't say that, that's a microaggression. Or multiculturalism is a scourge that is sweeping Canada. And what I got was a strong sense...
No, that has swept Canada.
Okay. Well, what I got was a very strong sense of people whose lives...
I never said that it was a scourge that swept Canada either. I wouldn't have said that.
Okay, well, I will go back and check your exact wording of what you said, but you definitely...
I'm not in favor of it as a fundamental doctrine.
Right, okay.
But I don't think it's a scourge.
So I wonder if you and I mean the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism, because you have a First Nations room in your house, right? You have a lot of First Nations stuff. How is the coexistence
I'm the honorary member of a First Nations family, as a matter of fact.
Which is wonderful. I have a First Nations artist from when I went to Canada last year. But that, to me, is the essence of Canadian multiculturalism, that culture being preserved and living alongside the Anglophone culture that, in some senses, supplanted it. How is that not multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. That's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world, and the world is full of war. So how can that possibly work? If you're going to bring people together and they're going to exist together in harmony, they have to be playing a game that everyone plays, that everyone knows the rules for. It can't be 10 different sets of rules for different people. That isn't going to work. So it's absolutely naive to believe. If that worked, the world wouldn't be full of war.
Well, before we had, multiculturalism, we still did have war. In fact, war is, as Steven Pinker, I'm sure you read what Steven Pinker says, this is the least violent time in human history. So
yes,
something
that's
is
a consequence of
working.
the patriarchal tyranny.
Well, if you think that the patriarchy's been eroded over the last 100 years, maybe that's what it's down to. Maybe you could give some credit to it for that.
I actually didn't say that the patriarchy had been eroded.
Well, because you don't believe it exists in the first place. Fair enough. But my definition of multiculturalism is citizenship-based, right? So you can be both Canadian and First Nations. You can be both Quebecois and also Canadian.
But that means that everybody in the multicultural milieu is one thing and another.
Right.
But they're all one thing and another.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, our Prime Minister said, well, there is no Canadian identity. It's like, well, okay, what is it that unites us?
Well,
Well, nothing. We all protect our cultures. It's like, well, that leads to war.
Okay,
Now, it
well,
doesn't only lead to war, obviously, but unless you have people operating within a shared framework of perception and value, they can't cooperate and compete peacefully. I don't understand how that's even a disputable topic. That's how you organize people.
okay,
around a
I
shared
think
set of
if that's what
visions.
he said, that's what Trudeau said, that is a dumb thing for the Prime Minister of Canada to say when you are Prime Minister of Canada. I
Yeah, you might say that.
would agree
all right.
much more with
Mhm.
what Barack Obama said when he said, you know, I'm trying not to make a red states America or blue states America or white America, black America. I'm trying to make a United States America. That to me
Yes,
is,
the Democrats are very good at that.
well, they try.
Played identity politics for the last 20 years. All they've done is inflame tribal tendencies, as far as I can tell. So he can say that, but it isn't obvious that it's the case. And it's not obvious to me at all that one of the consequences of Barack Obama's presidency was a reduction in racial tension in the United States.
No, I wouldn't agree with that either. I think a lot of people found having a black college-educated professor very alarming and threatening to their idea of
not
themselves
enough
as
of them
the dominant group.
to stop them from voting for him twice.
No, that is very true. But again,
It's fundamentally true, right? It's really the crucial issue at hand here.
no, but he built a big coalition of white, well-educated liberals and people of colour. I mean, that is the Democrat
Well,
electoral.
how do you explain the rise of racial tension in the United States then?
Well, I think it's caused by a lot of things, not least of one of which is the Republican Party inflaming it. You talk about the left playing identity politics. I think the right play identity politics all the time.
The right doesn't dominate the universities.
No,
And
but it
people
dominates.
talk,
But
for
Donald
example,
Trump is president, so
and
realistically,
Donald Trump is hardly a typical Republican.
no. I would say that he
In
accomplished.
fact, for most of his life, if I remember correctly, he was a Democrat.
Right. I don't think he has
Right,
any
so we're not
political.
going to blame Donald Trump on
allegiance
the
to-
right wing.
Okay, but I'm going to say the rest of the Republican Party are also quite happy to play, I would say, white identity politics. They did not dump him as their candidate when he said, Mexicans, they're not sending us their best people here, they're rapists, right? The whole idea of the United States, it said, I think a beautiful thing, all men are created equal, but it meant men, and it meant specifically white men. Women and black people could not vote. The US was founded on identity politics. This is not some new concept that has come along in the last 20 years.
The United States wasn't founded on identity politics.
Yes, it was.
That's absolutely absurd proposition. The United States was founded on the same principles that, what would you say, that played their powerful role through the development of English democracy. And that was nested inside a Judeo-Christian view that fundamentally presumed that both men and women were made in the image of God and that all people had divine value. And it took a long time for that set of ideas to fully manifest itself in the political realm. But to consider that a manifestation of identity politics is, I can't imagine why you would possibly do that.
I don't consider that a manifestation of identity politics. I consider having a constitution that says only some people are citizens to be a manifestation of identity politics.
Well, what do you think changed it across time? And look, let's get our definitions straight here. You can't lump all occurrences of non-equal treatment into the category of identity politics. Identity politics is a very specific thing. It's really only existed since the 1970s. You can't go back into 1770 and say that the founders of the American Constitution were playing identity politics.
They were
You
playing
might say
politics that was based on identity. That's my definition of identity
that's
politics.
not the definition of identity politics unless you play fast and loose with the definition. Identity politics is something that's... No one talked about identity politics 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's a new term. You can't say that people's proclivity to identify with their group is identity politics. That's just tribalism. And that's like, who knows how old that is? 1 million years old. 500,000 years old. And you're going to call tribalism identity politics? Well, that's not helpful. If you want to talk about tribalism, we could talk about tribalism. But identity politics is something that's nested inside a particular political view of the world. It's got a Marxist basis, and it manifests itself in postmodernism. And it emerged in the American France first in the 1970s, and then has swept through the American universities and increasingly the rest of the West since then. That's identity politics. If you want to talk about tribalism, that's fine. I'm not a fan of tribalism, which is why I don't like the identity politics types. And I don't care if they're on the right or the left. I think the right-wing use of identity as the primary marker for human categorization is as reprehensible and dangerous as it is on the left. My problem with the left at the moment, the fundamental problem with the radical left, is that they're hyper-dominant in academia. And that's not good. And that's not my opinion. You can go look at Jonathan Haidt's data and see for yourself. And he's as moderate a person as you could hope to find, and probably less prone to anger than me.
And I agree with you. I find a lot of students phenomenally irritating, but I would question how much power they have in contrast to the things that I find more worrying that are happening in the world today, right? Or even the professors, right? Even
Look,
professors.
20-year-olds don't have that much power, but they're not 20 forever. 10 years later, they're 30. And 20 years later, they're 40.
Right.
And whatever happens in the university happens everywhere 5 years later.
And very, very sadly for people in my politics, left-wing politics, what happens to people as they get older is that they've traditionally got more conservative. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you can make a case that the current, where people are when they're 20 today is actually going to be the ideology that takes them all the way through their life. That's never been the case. No, but
it'll be around long enough to do plenty of damage, like it already is.
Okay, but even if we accept that students and their POMO professors are quite annoying, which I think is probably something I agree with.
They're not just annoying. Like, they're destroying the universities, and that's not a good thing. And they're particularly destroying the social sciences and the humanities. The sciences are safe so far, but not for long, because the scientists in particular are terrible at politics, and the left-wing activists are great at politics. And so they'll win eventually. The National Science Foundation is already introducing diversity requirements for hiring in mathematics in universities. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to work. There are hardly any mathematical geniuses. If you start putting all sorts of arbitrary restrictions on their hiring, you're just going to end up not finding the ones that there are. So, besides,
I don't think that's true, actually, because if you say there are very few mathematical
geniuses. What do you know about it?
Well, next year I'm going to be a fellow at Oxford University, so I spend time talking to academics. I've talked to a lot of academics for my book. I do agree with you, there is an illiberal strain that is sweeping through a lot of universities. I don't think it's an existential threat, and I certainly don't think it is, to me, the biggest issue in world politics today. It's the one that I would choose personally.
What do you think is the biggest issue? I
think that the rise of strongmen, authoritarians around the world is very worrying, and that's one of the reasons that I find the subtitle of your book fascinating, because it's called An Antidote to Chaos. Why isn't it an antidote to order, which you also say in its excessive manifestations is bad?
I've said that. Well, you can't write a book about everything.
No, but you've specifically chosen Antidote to Chaos. So why is chaos the big...
I also have 300 lectures online, and I talk plenty about the pathology of order in those lectures.
Okay, but I'm just saying...
I'm no fan of authoritarian strongmen, that's for sure.
Well, that's good, but I do think that the way that you talk about order in the book is something that people will take away from it.
Be specific.
Okay, so let me think. The way that you talk about natural dominance hierarchies in lobsters. Let's get on to the lobsters. Because I think that the thing that people take away from that is male lobsters compete for female lobsters, and that says something about society now, that men need to be dominant in society. Because if lobsters do it, then there is something that we can read about humans from that too.
There's nothing in that chapter at all that suggests that the way that men should succeed in human hierarchies is a consequence of the exercise of power. There's not one line in that entire book that claims that, because it's not what I believe. Most human hierarchies, as I already pointed out, are hierarchies of competence, not power.
Okay, so
that's why we don't live in a patriarchal tyranny. And so if you want to be a successful man, then you should be competent, and that will move you up the hierarchy, and that will make you attractive, and for good reason, unless you want an incompetent mate, which is possible and happens, but isn't something that I would recommend. People will sometimes choose an incompetent mate because they're intimidated by competence, and so they'll settle for someone who they don't respect because they feel that they can master them and they won't be intimidated. But it's not a recipe for a happy life, I can tell you that. So there isn't a line in that chapter that talks about power as the proper means of conducting yourself in life. There's not a line in the book, and there's nothing in anything I've ever said that suggests that.
Okay,
but it's really important, because people have read this chapter, and they make exactly the argument that you make. And it's a misapprehension. So it's a misapprehension of the book.
Okay, but if so many people are getting the same misapprehension, could it be possible...
There aren't so many people that are getting it. There's 2 million people that have bought the book, and there's a very small handful of people who have a particular ideological perspective who enjoy developing that perspective because it indicates just what sort of reprehensible individual I am. But it has absolutely nothing to do with what I wrote or what I've said or what I believe. I don't believe that our fundamental hierarchies are based on power. I don't believe that the way that you move up our hierarchies is as a consequence of manifesting power. It's competence.
Okay. My big problem with the lobsters is that it's scientifically bollocks. right? It's just you cannot read across from lobsters and what they do to what humans do.
Of course you can. That's why serotonin works on lobsters.
But it works in two different ways. So serotonin makes lobsters more aggressive. It makes humans
it makes them
less
more dominant.
aggressive, right? That's what happens.
That's not right.
That
Serotonin makes human beings more dominant but less aggressive. And the only reason it makes them more dominant is because they're less irritable and they're less defensively aggressive. So it's not bollocks. I know my neurochemistry. So if you're going to play neurochemistry, let's go and do it.
Okay, well, you say antidepressants work on lobsters.
Yes, they do. They make a lobster that's been defeated in a fight more likely to fight again.
That's not the same mechanism that happens in humans, because
Yes,
lobsters
it is.
don't get depressed as the way that humans are. I think you're anthropomorphizing into a ridiculous degree. These are creatures that urinate out of their faces.
I think that the fundamental issue among knowledgeable animal behaviorists is that anthropomorphization with animals is generally the appropriate tactic unless you have reason to doubt it, which is because there's continuity between us and animals rather than discontinuity. And the idea that the anthropomorphization of animals is inappropriate is something derived from 1950s behaviorism. The highly trained affective neuroscientists and people who study motivation and emotion as well as neurochemistry know perfectly well that there is biological and behavioral continuity across the animal kingdom and way down into the kingdom as well, which is exactly why I chose lobsters, to indicate that there is so much continuity in the systems that allow us to estimate status position that we share it with creatures that are 1/3 of a billion years old. And the reason that I made that argument was to put paid, at least in part, to the absurd Marxist proposition that hierarchical structures are a secondary consequence of Western civilization and free market economies, which is as preposterous a perspective as you could possibly develop about anything. Hierarchies are 1/3 of a billion years old. You can't blame them on the West or men or capitalism. And we're wired for hierarchical perception in ways that you can hardly possibly imagine. Even our ability to rank order a set of objects seems to be tightly linked to our ability to assess the relative status of people in our social milieus. So, and the biochemistry is very, very similar. And the reason we know that is because most of the drugs that are used on people are first tested on animals. Now, it's not often animals as primitive as lobsters, but it is plenty. So a lot of what we know about neurological structure, for example, is a consequence of studying the flatworm, which is a much more primitive organism than the lobster. Continuity is the rule.
Okay, so what can we learn from killer whales that live in matriarchal pods, often led by a grandmother, someone who's been through a menopause? Why isn't that an example that you've picked to talk about in the book? It's because lobsters say the thing that ideologically you want to talk about, which is your belief that there is a kind of Marxist ideology sweeping.
How do lobsters say that? The point that I was making with lobsters, I just said what it was. That hierarchies have been around for a very long time.
But who genuinely, really, today is arguing, apart from maybe 3 mad Marxist academics, that there is no such thing as hierarchy? Hierarchies
They're not arguing
exist.
that there's no such thing as hierarchy.
Or there should be no such thing as hierarchies.
Oh, there are plenty of them are arguing that.
Really? Because I see that almost never in the wild as an argument. I see people think that hierarchy should be based on merit and they should be more equal.
What do you think the demand for equality of outcome is if it's not an attempt to flatten hierarchies or to eliminate them? What else could it possibly be? And you don't think the neo-Marxists and the postmodernists think that hierarchy is a social construction? Like, you're not talking about the same people that I know,
right.
That's for sure. Everything's a social construction for the social constructionists, including hierarchies.
But I just don't think that is a very widely held view in the world. It might be among liberal arts universities.
20% of social scientists identify as Marxist.
Where's that statistic from?
Look it up in Haidt's work.
Okay. I'm interested. I know.
I've checked it out quite carefully.
Yeah, but
It's a perfectly valid statistic. I don't have the reference at hand.
Yeah.
So it's 1 in 5. Okay, and the number of conservatives, or even liberals for that matter, in the social sciences and humanities is not only vanishingly small, but getting smaller. And you think the social constructionists believe that hierarchy is built into biology? They're not very good social constructionists if that's what they believe. And the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists are radical social constructionists because they wouldn't believe that human beings are infinitely malleable and that we can be recreated in whatever image the ideologues might want to recreate us in if they didn't think that. And it's much more prevalent than you're admitting. I mean, there isn't a competing position on campuses except among the evolutionary biologists and the evolutionary psychologists, let's say, and they're under complete attack They're certainly next on the chopping block as far as I can tell. I've been warning them for the last 2 years. Social constructionists don't like evolutionary psychologists, and they don't like biology. And I really don't understand why, except that it interferes with this idea that human beings are infinitely malleable and stops them from being able to blame hierarchy on the West. Look, if you're really concerned about the poor, as a social democrat, let's say, the first thing you should do is abandon your presupposition that the dispossession produced by hierarchies is a consequence of the patriarchal structure of the West. It's a way deeper problem than that. So there have been people who've been dispossessed forever, way before capitalism.
Okay, I think I would agree with that. So if it is a way deeper problem than that, how do you tackle it?
I don't know.
Well, that's a bit, I mean, that for someone as intelligent as you that just throw their hands up and go, ooh, maybe some people
There's lots of things I don't know how to tackle. I don't know how to tackle the fact that people range extremely widely in their cognitive ability either. These are big problems.
Right, but we could start with a redistributive tax policy, right, where people who earn a lot pay more tax than people lower down the income scale to redistribute income. That was a fairly obvious way that you could make poor people less poor. It's something that, you know, the Labour government did. They almost, I think they halved child poverty. It is possible to do things, and we do have mechanisms.
Well, I wouldn't make the immediate presumption that it was the redistributive tax policy that halved child poverty. You know, that absolute poverty in the world has halved between the year 2000 and 2012, and you can't attribute that to redistributive policies.
No, I can't. I'm only talking about Britain. I'm talking about that particular government, which had, you know, then there are fiscal analyses that have been done. But I think, let's move on from lobsters. I mean, you know.
That chapter is about people becoming responsible and competent, not about them becoming like dominant and powerful.
Okay,
it's not that at all.
But my problem with it is I think you got criticised by a lot of marine biologists, right, and by a lot of geneticists
I think
for
one.
it. Okay, well, I can name it. P.Z. Myers is one who's criticised you. Adam Rutherford, who's former editor of Nature, has criticised that chapter. There are, you know, that is not. But what I think is fascinating is that
no reasonable biologists dispute the fact that most organisms organize themselves into hierarchies, and that the fundamental biological mechanism for the regulation of hierarchy is the serotonin system. That's not disputable. Now, you can find animal organizational structures that vary from that, what would you call it, fundamental pattern. But the existence of variance isn't proof against the existence of a fundamental pattern. Like, I don't know how you can sit there and be skeptical about this. If you know the literature on hierarchical structure, you understand that across the entire animal kingdom, animals tend to organize themselves into hierarchies.
But
and that the neurochemistry
but very different types of hierarchies, right?
So well, there's a pattern.
You have,
that's why we know they're hierarchies.
Right. Yeah, but like you say, the pattern as if that, you know, the
hierarchy is the pattern.
Right. Okay, and that's fine. So chimps have one very obvious social structure, and bonobos have another.
It's not
one.
as different as people have made it out to be. No. The bonobos are a lot more violent than the
and they're not hippie monkeys, right?
Observers of the bonobos have admitted.
Okay, but nonetheless, you say that as if those little details don't matter, as if there can't be such a thing as a hierarchy that is much worse than another hierarchy. That's my problem with it.
I'm not saying that at all. There's clearly hierarchies that are worse than other hierarchies.
Right.
Baboons have terrible hierarchies, for example.
And
tyrannical hierarchies aren't my cup of tea.
Right.
That isn't the point I was making.
No.
The point I was making was that hierarchies can't be blamed on capitalism or the West. They're built into our biology. The neurochemistry is so old that we share it with crustaceans, so that's 1/3 of a billion years, which is the proof that hierarchies aren't a recent construct. If proof like that needs to be provided, and that the best way for people to adopt a strategy that will move them up the hierarchy, which is a desirable thing in most regards, is to face the suffering of the world forthrightly. That's what that chapter is about. And the people who've been criticizing it read it as if it's a defense of the Western patriarchy. It's like, there's no defense of the Western patriarchy.
No, I don't think that's true. I think the way that people criticize it is and I think this happens a lot with evolutionary psychology, is which is not quite what the lobsters are, but is where other stuff in the book is. Other things you said, for example, like women wear rouge because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Right. Well, for a start,
why do you think women wear rouge?
I have absolutely no idea, but
right,
I will tell you.
That's really not a very good answer.
Well, yeah, you said before there were lots of things you don't know the answer to, but I'll tell you one thing.
I'm not criticizing your perspective on this. You're criticizing mine, so I'm presuming you have an alternative idea. Why do you think women wear makeup?
Why do you think there are an enormous number? But let's go back to why women wear rouge, because it reminds men of ripe fruit. Okay, first of all, not all ripe fruit is red. Why would you,
You know,
want
we
to... Do you
evolved
want to...
color vision to detect ripe fruit. Eh?
Do you want to eat women? No. I think unless men are having sex
You
with
might
ripe
want to
fruit,
taste them.
that's not really well. And where is the evidence that women who are redder in the cheeks are have more offspring?
What do you think happens during
But
a sexual flush?
But that's the key point, isn't it? Is that you would expect, actually, if this is a sexual selection, that women who are
Yeah,
redder would have more children. We would get progressively redder over time.
One of the hallmarks of youthful skin is the proclivity for it to flush red. And yes, youthful women have more children. It's a primary sign of fertility.
That, I think you're using...
Wait a second here. What do you think women wear makeup for? Come on, if you're going to go after me on this,
Okay.
let's women. People say, well, women wear makeup to feel better about themselves. It's not a very deep analysis. Why makeup? Why facial makeup?
I'll tell you why I wear makeup, which is to stop the comments that I would get if I didn't wear makeup. And my gender, I always say my gender is low maintenance, right? I don't feel particularly like a woman inside. I don't really know what that would mean. But what I try and do is try and look, you know, in the same way that you get black women who talk about the problem with natural hair, is it's seen as unprofessional, right? And as a woman, if you don't wear makeup, that is seen as a political choice. That is seen as something that, you know, you are...
So you wear makeup to protect yourself from what? From tyrannical
judgment.
men?
No, but and tyrannical women as well, I would say. I think women very harshly judge each other's appearance, and there are very good reasons for that. But
probably because they've learned that from oppressive men.
no, I don't think so.
Why do you think it is then?
I think that women are encouraged to be seen as being in competition with each other.
Encouraged? You don't think that there's anything about that that's natural, eh?
Well, I would be reluctant to get into that because I think you could talk about intrasexual competition. I think that's a very big deal among the social sciences and evolutionary science. It's not my particular competence. But yeah, I wouldn't. My conception of the patriarchy is not that men are beastly to women. It is that there is a structure in which women participate too that overall privileges and benefits men in order to control female reproduction. And I think those are two very different things.